Hello, Professor Mandeville again. If you're wondering where I'm located, I'm at the Champlain Memorial Library in the village of Champlain. It's obviously closed also, but I have access to it because my wife is the librarian here. So I've decided to do my lectures from this spot. It's a good spot, and I'm all by myself, so I won't pester my wife and my dog. So, today what we're going to do here in History 101, we're going to pick up where we left off. And that was with this handout right here. Now, if you've misplaced this handout, I've put a PDF of it in Module 2 in the particular book entitled Century of Conflict. So you can access it there, you could print it out, you can do whatever you want with it. But we're going to go over this. We've gone through most of it. I'm going to do a little bit of review, and then today, mainly, we're going to focus upon an extremely important war, the French and Indian War. So, you're also going to want to open your textbooks up to page 110, because we're going to be looking at this map, because as you'll find out, most of the French and Indian War took place right here in the North Country. Now, today I also scanned a copy of this map in case you don't have your hands on a textbook yet, and you'll see that in the same mini lecture on the Century of Conflict. It's just labeled map, and if you click on it, you'll see the PDF of the map. So, let's pick up where we left off. Remember this handout. We already covered King William's War, which we talked about was a war between France and England. Like all four of these wars that happened over approximately a 100-year period. It's a struggle for empire, as we've been emphasizing. And in this particular war, it ended up in a draw. And as we also have pointed out in the past, as you'll probably remember, or you may not, one of the main targets of the British in all four of these wars is the capture of Quebec, meaning the capture of Quebec City, which is the capital of New France in the colonies. Now, there was an invasion led by Sir William Phipps in an attempt to capture Quebec. It failed. King William's War ended up in a draw. So they settled things at the negotiation table. Now, you'll remember we also pointed out the fact earlier that there's a trend here. When a war ends in a draw, they'll be fighting very quickly. And we've already covered the fact that it just took them 5 short years and they're back at it again. And the second war that came about was Queen Anne's War. We've already discussed that. The major occurrence in that particular conflict was the French raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts, sometimes known as the Deerfield Massacre. This strategy by the French to try to instill fear in the civilian population failed. It backfired on them, and it rallied support among the colonists. And as a result of that, the British prevailed in Queen Anne's War and won a significant amount of territory from the French as a result, including Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and most importantly, the Hudson Bay region for all of its furs. And we talked about that in the Hudson Bay blankets and so forth. So, the other part of our review today is the third war, King George's War. This war, we had a 30-year period of peace between wars because there was one clear-cut victor, the British in Queen Anne's War. So, in this particular war, the major event that took place was when forces raised in New England by William Pepperell successfully captured the fort at Louisburg, which is the key to ultimately capturing Quebec, because if you control Louisburg, you control the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Now, in that mini lecture online, Century of Conflict, I provided a link to the fortress at Louisbourg, which is now operated by Parks Canada. Explore that link. See how important that is. And this brings me to another point. I've embedded numerous links in all the mini lectures. Click on them and explore them. They're all very valuable, and you'll learn a lot from these links. It's almost like touring the North Country via the internet. So, unfortunately, King George's War ended in a draw, and the British made a gigantic mistake. At the negotiation table, and remember, all four of these wars, the conflicts are happening on both sides of the Atlantic. There are battles in Europe, there are battles in North America. So at the negotiation table, they're going to trade some captured territories. And the British, very foolishly, are going to give back the fortress at Louisbourg to the French. This was a gigantic mistake because it alienates the British colonists. It was British colonists who fought very hard, and many gave up their lives to capture Louisbourg. And when the British just gave it back to the French without thinking at the negotiation table, the British colonists sort of got this feeling that our lives are worthless. We're like pawns. The British don't care about us. And when it came to the next war that we're going to be talking about in more detail today, the French and Indian War, the British had a hard time getting the colonists to cooperate. So, the reason why, Louisbourg was on their minds. So, this war ended in a draw, so we know that the next war is going to happen very quickly, and that's the French and Indian War. You may have learned this war in European history as the 7 Years' War, but remember, we only care what the American names are. So, in this particular war, the British come up with a very brilliant strategy led by a Brit by the name of William Pitt. The Crown puts William Pitt in charge of coming up with a strategy to finally and once and for all defeat the French and remove them from the North American continent. Now, William Pitt is going to start organizing the war effort 2 years before the war even begins. He'll start organizing in 1754. The war won't begin until 1756. Now, one obstacle he's going to come up against is the colonists aren't interested in assisting the British, even though it means removal of the age-old enemy, the French, from North America, because Louisbourg is still on their minds. So, what he's going to do is he's going to call a meeting to take place in Albany, New York in 1754. It will become known as the Albany Congress. All 13 colonies were instructed by the British to send delegations to Albany to come up with a strategy to assist the British in defeating the French in what will be the French and Indian War. Now, at this Congress, the person that's going to dominate the Congress and be elected the chairman to preside over the whole affair in Albany, New York, is our old buddy, Benjamin Franklin. Now, there's going to be a few things that happen at the Albany Congress, and all of them are going to be put together into a document that's going to be entitled the Albany Plan, which is authored by the 13 colonies. One thing they discuss right in the beginning is the problem that the British have gathering Indian allies to assist them in their wars. The French have a monopoly on Indian allies. Part of the problem was one hand didn't know what the other was doing. Each individual colony was trying to negotiate alliances with native tribes like the Iroquois and others to fight with them against the French. But they're all bargaining separately. And the Iroquois especially are taking advantage of this and allowing all the colonies to shower them with gifts and then basically saying, thanks, but no thanks. Because they felt like the British colonies they were just a disorganized mess. So, part of the Albany Plan was to have a centralized colonial agency to negotiate with Indian tribes on behalf of all 13 colonies. So in essence, one hand knew what the other hand was doing. Now, a second part of the Albany Plan was they wanted to do something about this bad taste in their mouths about Louisburg. Colonial troops weren't willing to volunteer for this. So, what they came up with as a plan was, why don't we have a separate colonial-raised army that will be trained by colonists, led by colonial officers, and that colonial army will assist the British in the conflict against the French. Because then the soldiers will feel more like they're counted as humans. They'll be under the command of fellow colonists, and they'll feel more on their own, not just pawns of the British. Now, they went on in this plan to talk about how to fund this. And the idea was, let's have a colonial-wide tax that's collected in all 13 colonies, and the revenue from that tax will pay for the organization, the equipping, the training of this colonial-wide army to assist the British. So, to sum things up, the Albany Plan called for a colonial-wide negotiating group for Native American allies, a colonial-wide army led by colonists, funded by a colonial tax, and this was the colonists' plan that they were instructed by William Pitt to come up with, that they believed if it was implemented, the colonies would go full-fledged ahead and assist the British in their quest to eliminate the French from North America. So, the Albany Plan was drawn up, approved. Ben Franklin took it back to his print shop in Philadelphia, printed up copies to be circulated throughout the colonies, and given to the British. So, the British are handed this Albany Plan. What do you think they thought of it? They thought the people that attended the Albany Congress were out of their minds. Why in the world would we allow you to get your own Indian allies to ally themselves with your own formed army that you're paying for yourselves to fight the French? Now, it makes sense to the colonists, but the British were wise enough to know if they're successful, the French are eliminated from North America. What stops this brand new army with their native allies from turning their weapons towards the British and saying, why don't you follow the French right across the Atlantic and go back where you came from? It was a formula for a continental army with a continental government with Native American allies. This was like a blueprint for the American Revolution. Nobody knew it at the time, but that's what it was. So the British firmly turned down this idea of the Albany Plan. But they tried to salvage parts of it. They liked the idea of having one negotiating unit to go and talk to Native allies. They knew that'd be more effective. It made a lot of sense. But they wanted to be the masters of that particular negotiation, not just strictly colonists. And they also salvaged part of this idea of having a colonial army. Here's what they did. They sent a select group of colonists to British Officers Training School. They trained side by side with British officers, learned all the British strategies, techniques, and so forth, And then they were commissioned as officers in the British Army. Then this select group of colonial officers would be recruiters, and they would recruit colonists to serve under them. But ultimately, they would be junior officers in the British Army, and they'd be taking their commands from senior officers in the regular British Army. Seemed like a good idea at the time to the British. As we'll find out later on, this is going to backfire miserably on the British. So, that's the setup for the French and Indian War. What's going on over in England proper, William Pitt is amassing the largest army and navy known to the Western world. He is going to have a blank check to build all the ships he wants for the British Navy, raise as many soldiers, because the British are serious this time. They're sick of fooling around with the French. They believe they can be the dominant power in North America, especially since Spain is starting to fade away. And they see this as their opportunity to eliminate the French once and for all from North America and open the door for British domination of the entire continent. So, this sets the stage for the French and Indian War. The next lecture that I'm going to deliver today, but I'll record it separately, will be on what happened in the war itself, especially focusing on events that happened right here in our backyard in the North Country. So, thanks for listening to me. I'm trying to keep these to 15 or 20-minute shots of lecture at a time because I know you'll nod off and fall asleep if it's any longer than that. I know I would. And one other thing I would just want to mention right now that I forgot to mention earlier. I'm going to record several of these 15 to 20-minute lectures. I'm going to be selective, though. I'm going to tell you about things that are particularly important to the North Country here in the beginning with the French and Indian War. Then we'll talk about the American Revolution from the aspect of what happened right here in our own backyard also. Then as we go on through the rest of the semester, obviously I'm not going to be able to deliver all the lectures I would to you in class. That's why I've taken the time to put so many links in the mini lectures that you'll read so you can self-teach. But I'm going to give you the highlight of the lectures that I feel are the most important and also the ones I like talking about the best because we all have to benefit from this. And during this time, we should all try to have fun. I know it's going to be difficult, but that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to sign off on this lecture on a review of the century of conflict and William Pitt's plan to annihilate the French. I'll pick up with the French and Indian War in the North Country next. Take care. Be safe. Bye.